Trauma permeates our thoughts, behaviors, and emotions, shaping our responses to the world around us. But the question of healing remains: can someone truly overcome their trauma? Welcome to Normalize the Conversation. I'm your host, Francesca Reicheter, and today I'm joined by author, psychiatrist, therapist, and trauma specialist, Dr. Frank Anderson. In this episode, we're diving into the intricacies of trauma and its lasting effects, unpacking the distinction between trauma and PTSD, the role of forgiveness in the healing process, and the reality that past traumas can resurface even after we've made progress. Join us as we navigate the complexities of trauma, the journey of healing and resilience, and the path to reclaiming our lives. Frank, thank you so much for joining me today. I am very excited for our conversation, but before we begin, I just want to check in. How are you really?
How am I really? I am excited and overwhelmed. That's what I would say. I am, there is so much going on in my life right now. And even too much of a good thing is overwhelming. That's what I would say. Like, my world is exploding right now and it's so wonderful, but it's so full, right? And so I'm having trouble sleeping a little bit. I'm like boom, 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 from one thing to the next, one thing to the next. So it's interesting to like have a history of being overwhelmed by overwhelming things and now to be overwhelmed by wonderful things. So it's an interesting paradox, which I'm sure we'll dive into during our conversation. But thanks for asking.
Of course, it's so funny to me that no one talks about how overwhelming it can be when things are really good and there's so much happening and it's something you've been waiting for and you're so excited for. And then it's like, oh my goodness, I still can't catch my breath.
Yes. Yeah, it's great. It is, and that is something like, as a trauma expert, I've been working in the trauma field since 1992. So a really long time, right? And yeah, I know all the neurobiology of PTSD and dissociation, the effects of cortisol and what they have on our body. And yeah, I'm experiencing a lot is a lot, whether it's a lot of good or a lot of bad, because there is this overwhelm even with good. And I think it's confusing for people, like, oh, this good stuff, so I shouldn't be overwhelmed, or I shouldn't feel anxious, or I shouldn't feel like it's too much. I'm supposed to be happy now, right? So I think it's it's good to talk about it, and it's good to acknowledge a lot is a lot, whether it's good or bad. As when I work with people who have trauma histories and we do this big, huge healing session, and I think they're going to come in the next session and be like, oh my God, Frank, this is amazing. I feel so good. Thank you. And they're like, oh my God, I'm freaking out. It's too much of a good thing. Like, I'm overwhelmed by the positive. So I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot is a lot either way.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, at least for me, there's this idea that I can't feel overwhelmed and frustrated because I'm so grateful that it's
Yes.
happening and that there's good
Yes.
things. And it's so hard to let it
Yeah.
coexist. You can
Yeah.
be grateful and excited and happy and
Yes.
also overwhelmed and still get frustrated and still feel like it's too much to handle. It can
Yeah.
coexist. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And
Right.
that's something I'm learning to allow.
That's beautiful. Yeah, because I am grateful. Like, there is a lot of wonderful things going on in my life. It's where it's like, careful what you ask for. Like, the more you put out there and then the more you receive. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's good. This reminds me, I don't know, for some of the listeners, some people, this happens with divorce too. Like, I know this is a weird association, but sometimes when people are like, oh my gosh, I've gotten out of a really difficult relationship, and part of me wants to say congratulations, or like, oh, I'm so sorry, right? But like, that's the same thing. Like, when you're in a dysfunctional relationship and you're in it and you're overwhelmed and it feels hard and difficult, when you actually get out of something like that, right? You can feel overwhelmed by the good of that. Like I'm so grateful that I got out of something that was harmful and not good for me, but I'm still overwhelmed by the good of being out of something bad, right? I see it in relationships a lot. Like, I'm supposed to be happy because I got out of a bad relationship. Why am I overwhelmed by it all? Right? So it happens in a lot of different arenas.
Yeah, and change can be scary and overwhelming in itself.
Yes, yes, totally. That's right. Yeah,
And
I think about change versus familiar.
yeah,
People are more comfortable and familiar, whether it's positive or negative, because change leads more to unknown and uncertainty, which is anxiety provoking, right? Familiar and change.
yes, and that moment where reminds me of the Barbie movie where it's like
Hey,
you can
great.
make
I
that
love our
decision,
associations right now. That's great. Tell me about
right?
the Barbie movie, Fran.
It's like making that choice. Do you want to stay with where you're at, or do you want
Yeah,
to make a big change that could be
yeah.
amazing and awesome, or
Yes.
it could not go as well as you imagine and hope? And it's making that leap and knowing that it's going to be scary and overwhelming and frustrating and amazing and beautiful, and all of that is okay.
Yeah, I love
Now
it. I
thinking
love
about
it.
the movie.
I love it. And it is the transition. Like, one of the things I'm aware of is exactly that transition is where there's more activation and there's more uncertainty, and it's scarier because when you move through the change, you're like, oh my goodness, of course, this is where I belong. This feels right. Like, you can get to that place of feeling good about something that has changed, but the transition in and of itself is loaded with fear and uncertainty and overwhelm, even if it's a positive change. So you get there, you can get there, but um yeah, it's hard to make a big change. That's something that's coming up with me right now, from all the stuff that's going on. I have this memoir that's coming out May 7th. Like, I'm really in this ramp up for this memoir, and talk about scary and overwhelming and exciting. Like, I've written this book about my life. The title is To Be Loved, right? And it's about my trauma history. Like, I am this quote trauma expert. I've been doing trauma treatment for my whole life and my whole career. And they asked me to write a book about my personal experiences in trauma. And many experts don't expose their vulnerability in that way. And so, as excited as I am about this book coming out May 7th, I also get these waves of panic, like, oh my God, everybody is going to know my deepest, darkest secrets. Like, holy crap. Like, I get these panic moments. It's like I'm exposing myself in this way in the service of helping others heal. And I fully believe it is the right thing to do. It feels really aligned to my purpose of bringing trauma healing to the world. And it's super excited. I can't wait, but I get overwhelmed by the exposure and the repercussions of being that vulnerable with so many strangers.
First of all, congratulations. That is amazing.
Thank you.
But also, that is really overwhelming when you're putting something out there that's so
Yeah.
vulnerable and people are
Yeah.
really seeing you, and their
Yeah.
responses often can feel so personal.
Yeah. That's right. Well, in this memoir, it was, for some reason, it was important. Like, I've been teaching to trauma treatment to therapists for many, many years. And the publisher was like, Frank, you have a story to tell that can help a lot of people. Please tell your story. So I was like, okay, fine. I am open and willing to do that. um, the thing that I got when I started writing it, first of all, it's so therapeutic to write about your life in that way, different than any therapy. It's like I'm doing a course called Write to Heal, WRITE, because it's so valuable to do that. But the thing that I would say that I kept coming up against and it was like a message, Fran. It was like, let people know of the ways you've been hurt and the ways you've hurt others. Like, that was an important part of this memoir. It was not like, oh, poor Frank, he's a victim. Like, we've heard enough of that. And that's true, but it's not the only side of the story. Anybody who's been hurt internalizes harmful energy because you're the recipient of it. So we all can hurt or hurt others. And that was an important part of this memoir, to write the range, because everybody has that. And so that's part of the scariness around, is like, oh my goodness, I'm going to not only talk about the vulnerabilities of the way I've been violated, I'm going to also talk about the ways I've hurt other people. And that felt important and scary.
That is so powerful because it's so true. A lot of times
Right.
when we're hurting, we may unintentionally hurt others.
Right.
And to
Right.
own up to the fact that that's happened is, I mean, it's human. It's
Yes.
human.
Yes.
But a
Yeah.
lot of times we want to only talk about what hurt us and not take that personal responsibility and awareness of, I've also made mistakes. And as
Yes.
humans, it's okay to make mistakes, but I'm healing and learning so that I don't continue to treat
Right.
people the way I was treated and didn't want to be treated.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. And I think that's a big message. I'm not sure. I love the way you're responding to it, right? That's my hope. I'm not sure that the world is going to respond that way. It's like, the heck with that. People want to stay in the victim perpetrator mode, right? I'm the victim, they're the perpetrator, right? I'm the good, they're the bad. I think there's a lot of culture in society that holds that all or nothing view, but I'm trying to change the conversation a little bit here. Like, wait a minute, aren't we all both? Like, if we really think about it, if we're really honest, aren't we all both? And for me, that's the real inroads to healing, is when we can acknowledge the both of all of us. Because then, I'm not going to just blame, like, I can have more compassion for what you did to me if I can own what I've done to others, right? Or even what I've done to myself as a result of what happened to me too, right? So I think it's a big piece of this memoir, To Be Loved.
Yes, that is, it's amazing because I always say, like, I'm the villain in someone else's story. And that is
Yes.
terrible to think about because I would never
Yeah.
want to be the villain in someone
Right.
else's story. But it's the truth. And hopefully I've started to become aware of who I may have been the villain in their story and
Yes.
how I can hopefully make amends if that's something that's
Yeah.
possible, so that I don't continue to be the villain.
Yeah.
And they can also heal and move through it too,
Yeah.
because I know when someone's hurt me and continues to hurt me and I've never
Yeah.
set that boundary and
Yeah.
they just continue, it's harmful, it's hurtful, and it makes it so hard for me to want to love myself when I feel like
Right.
maybe someone's right that I don't deserve to be loved because they're attacking me. I don't know, I'm like circling through this right now, rambling. But I always want to make sure that I'm hopefully honest on mistakes I've made and trying to do what I can, whether it's being able to make amends with them personally or just make that change so in the future I don't cause that same pain to someone else.
Well, part of why this is so important, and I was just writing about this recently in an article I was writing, is if we can't acknowledge, like, if the person who's hurt us can't acknowledge what they've done, and if we can't acknowledge what they've done, we tend to take responsibility for what was done to us. Okay. So if you're going to say, you're no good, Frank, you're worthless, you're bad. And if I don't take responsibility for that, you're going to say, oh, I must be bad, I must be wrong. Right. So we take responsibility for what was done to us if the other person doesn't. Right. And that cycle continues. So if I can say, hey, this was done to me and that was harmful. And hey, I've done this and this was harmful. Like, we want to take responsibility for what we do and give the other person responsibility for what they've done to us. That stops the cycle of like taking responsibility for other people's actions personally. That's what shame is. Like, when somebody blames us for being bad and wrong and we internalize it, I must be bad and wrong. It's like, no, you were wrong for saying that to me, and I was wrong for taking it on and acting this way, right? That's a huge shift in the way we're going to interact with each other.
It really is. And that brings up for me something that happened last week, or I guess it's something that continues to happen. But
Yeah.
I take care of my grandmother who has
Yeah.
Alzheimer's.
Yep.
And something that's really hard is I do a lot of that. I take on most of the responsibility.
Yes.
And a lot of times, maybe I'm like trying to be careful in case other family members listen, but they don't.
Yeah.
So
That's a whole nother story, right?
whole other story. But and they don't always want to take the initiative to do something
Yeah.
to help. And I had to learn how to use a drill and install cameras.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I couldn't reach. It was too high up and I was struggling. The chair was wobbling and I got really frustrated. I was like, I need help.
Yeah.
And the person I had asked to help for was like, well, if you don't want to help and you just, or you know what, your grandmother can go into assisted living because you clearly don't care.
Mm.
And they're like, you just don't want the responsibility. And for me, I was like, okay, I don't care. I'm a terrible person. I don't want to help her. It's going to be my fault that she goes into assisted living.
Yeah.
Instead of, oh my goodness, I am in my mid 20s flying across the country so that I can take care of my grandmother and be a student. So hopefully keep her from going into assisted living as long as I can. But I'm not acknowledging any of the good things. I'm just internalizing everything that I could be doing wrong, which is in this situation, in this very specific situation,
Yes.
didn't do anything wrong. I asked for help. And that
That's
should
right.
never be something that you're punished for. But back to what you said, it's when someone treats us that way, it's so easy to just internalize and be like, it must be me, when
That's right.
they're probably just maybe feeling a little guilty for not being able to do it.
Yes. Exactly, exactly. And that is that differentiation that's super important. Kids don't have the capacity to do this with their parents, because if you're growing up in a family, kids are dependent on their parents for survival. So kids, it's too hard for kids to say, hey, wait a minute, like that's your issue, this is mine. Like kids can't do that. Kids need their parents for survival. And so kids say, oh, if they say it, the people with the power, then it must be true and it must be my fault, right? That's how it happens. That's how we internalize things. When the people in power don't take responsibility for their piece, we tend to take responsibility. It must be me. I'm bad and wrong, because they're not saying, hey, I should have never said that. That was my fault. I'm feeling guilty, so I'm projecting this onto you. You see what I'm saying? So when people don't take responsibility for their piece, we tend to take responsibility for it. And it's a distortion of responsibility and perpetuates the trauma cycle, really.
Yeah,
I grew up, I'm bad and wrong. Like, this is what I was the recipient of a lot of physical and verbal abuse, as I talk about in the memoir. And, I kept feeling it's my fault. I'm bad and I'm wrong. I was sent to therapy when I was 6 years old, right? Which I talk about in the book. And so it was like, I'm clearly a problem. There's clearly something wrong with me that needs to be fixed. Nobody told me what it was, right? So I just went to this like shameful therapy, didn't know why. And nobody explained, hey, this is what's going on. This is what we're struggling with. I didn't learn that till years later. So it's like, I'm bad and wrong. That's what we do.
it's heartbreaking that that's the cycle, and then it continues, right? So then if we never heal from that, we never learn and heal and become aware, then we may project it onto our kids, and then they'll do it to their kids, and it's just this never-ending cycle of someone who just needed self-love early on.
Yeah, it's transgenerational trauma. That's really what it is, right? It's like, and there are ways to, like, this part of the book is like, there are ways to break the cycle. Like, that's what I want people to know. Like, what you're doing is kind of breaking the cycle. Like, you're stepping outside and you're doing it differently, right? And that's the message for the book, is like, hey, yes, this stuff can be thrust upon us. We can internalize it as, I'm bad and I'm wrong, it must be me. And there's a way to heal from it. There's a way to release what's not yours, doesn't belong to you, right? And there's a way to take responsibility for what is yours, right? And that's the way we can break the cycle. I have this thing like, break the trauma cycle, break the trauma cycle. That's That's doable. Like, I want people to know you don't have to just keep perpetuating it.
Yeah, you really don't. I'm excited for your memoir to come out. That's
Right.
So this episode will probably come out just after it comes out. So
Yeah.
anyone listening, check it out. I can't wait to check it out. But
Beautiful.
we're talking so much about trauma, you're a
Yes.
trauma expert, that I don't think a lot of people know what trauma is or the difference
Yes.
between trauma and PTSD. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's an important question because people throw around trauma and PTSD as if they're interchangeable. And they're not, in my experience. Like, trauma is what happens to you. PTSD is a response to the trauma. And I think about something like PTSD are the symptoms that develop as a result of the trauma. Trauma is an overwhelming event that happens to you. And I think about intensity, frequency, and duration when I think about trauma. Like, what is the intensity of the experience? What is the frequency? How often does it last? How often does it happen? And what's the duration? How long does it last? So I'm always looking at intensity, frequency, and duration when I'm thinking about somebody experiencing an overwhelming event, being bullied on a playground, having a car accident, being in a domestically abusive relationship, or growing up in a dysfunctional family. You've got to think about those things when you're thinking about the trauma. And the greater the intensity, the increase the frequency, and the longer the duration, the worse the outcomes are. And the more chronic PTSD you'll develop, because PTSD are really symptoms. Like, there's 3 clusters of symptoms in PTSD. Cluster A is like re-experiencing and re-intrusive images. So if you go through something overwhelming, you can have intrusive images and a re-experiencing of the traumatic event. It happens with school shootings and things like that, right? The second cluster is, because we're so overwhelmed, it's numbing, avoiding, and disconnecting. Some people get freaked out and have panic attacks. Other people get numb, detached, and disconnected. That's the second cluster of PTSD. The third cluster of PTSD is hyperarousal, heart racing, panic attacks, anxiety. So those are the symptoms of PTSD. Those are the symptoms of PTSD that are the result of trauma. Everybody who experiences a trauma doesn't automatically develop PTSD. Sometimes we recover from the trauma without getting PTSD. We know if the symptoms last longer than 30 days, then it's considered PTSD. So it's an important difference, and I'm glad you asked about it.
It is a very important difference. Thank you for clarifying.
Yes.
And also, I wish that this was how PTSD was explained to me in school.
Right.
I'm doing my master's in clinical psych, and we were talking about PTSD on Tuesday night, and it was not explained this eloquently. I really, really, it makes it make a lot more sense and helps you understand that, first of all, we all have different responses to trauma. And it's not always PTSD, but when it is, it's important to know the warning signs and know that it's okay to seek help. But just because you don't develop PTSD does not mean that your experience is any less valid.
Yes, 100%. 100%. Like, that's so important that you say that, because there's a range of responses. There's a spectrum. Like, you can have 3 siblings in a household, and they each respond totally differently to the same event, right? And there's a sensitivity that we have. There's different coping styles that we all develop. Like, everybody's different. So one person is like, hey, no big deal, F you. And another person like totally takes it personally, shuts down, and gets told, develops an eating disorder or substance abuse as a result of it. Like, so you can't compare suffering. You can't compare responses, because everyone's different in the way they respond to the same event. Like you look at school shootings or like any of these global traumas, look at the pandemic. Everybody responded differently to it, right? Some people baked bread. Some people, freaked out. Some people got divorced. Some people, like, there was a whole range of responses to it. So you can't just automatically assume everybody's going to react the same.
Yes. And I love what you said about how siblings can respond differently, because I think a lot of times, I'll use me and my brother as an example, that maybe one of us is better at coping than the other. And one of us just doesn't take it as personally. And I think our responses are just so different because we're different people. And it doesn't mean that one of us is experienced it worse than the other. It doesn't mean that one of us is better at managing than the other. I'm sure that those could be true, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's true just because we experience and respond differently. And I think that's so important, because a lot of times we may invalidate one sibling, we might invalidate one family member or one person inside a traumatic experience because their response is so significantly different outward versus inward.
Yeah. And people have a tendency to kind of judge the response.
Yeah.
Don't act that way. Don't be so dramatic. Don't make such a big deal about it. Do you know what I mean? So people don't validate our experience as much as they push it away, because they don't want to feel bad about what they did, or they can't tolerate intense feelings, right? So they'll try to downplay your reaction and your response as the problem instead of validating and acknowledging it, because it's hard to be with difficult feelings for most people.
Yes. Oh, if one more person tells me don't be dramatic,
right?
It's just, why are we saying that especially to kids who are experiencing emotions? Why aren't we telling them that it's okay to feel? Let's talk about what you're feeling and how that's impacting you. How can we move through and process this feeling? How can we cope with this feeling? It doesn't have to be just you're being dramatic. It reminds me of when you're younger and like one sibling will hit the other sibling, and then they're like, don't cry. Don't do it, right? Like, don't respond. Just let me treat you how I want to treat you. And then our parents will tell us, don't be dramatic. You're looking for attention. Stop crying. Get over it. And that cycle just perpetuates. And as we get older, we're telling ourselves, don't cry. Just get through it. Don't let anyone know you're being dramatic. You're not trying hard enough. And we are hurting ourselves instead of allowing ourselves space to say, this hurts. Like, this hurts, and that's okay. And we can hopefully develop some tools to process and get through.
Right. Well, and the reason we can't tolerate somebody else's feelings is because we can't tolerate our own. I'm going to shut yours down if I can't handle mine. And if I've been pushing mine away, I'm going to push yours away. Like I worked on this project with Pixar years ago on the movie Inside Out, right? And Inside Out 2 is coming out like in June. I'm so excited about it. Like, there's going to be Inside Out 2 coming out this June, which is great. And it's like Riley, for those of you who saw the movie, she's a teenager now, right? And she's developing all these new emotions because she's a teenager, which is so cool. But the reason I bring it up, what popped into my head was Amy Poehler plays the role of Joy in the Pixar Inside Out. And after she did the movie role, after she played the role of Joy, she's like, oh my God, do you know how many times I've told my kids, don't be sad, don't be sad, don't be sad. Like, it was a game changer for her playing this role, because she's like, we just automatically do it. We don't want to deal with our own feelings. So when we see feelings in somebody else, we're like, don't feel this, don't feel that. You're too much. You're too much. Like, and that's a problem, right? My son, my oldest son, my youngest son, who's 16 now, when we're watching a movie together, he's always looking at me. He's like, you crying yet? You crying yet? Like, as if it's like this big problem, right? And what I say to him is like, do you know how many years of therapy I went to be able to cry like this? Like, you let me cry, and you got to be okay with it, because that's about you, buddy. Like, I am finally able to cry and be okay with it. And I don't need a 16-year-old teenager with his attitude telling me don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. It's kind of funny. I'm like, I grew up with that and I don't need it anymore. So, I'll have my feelings. You can have yours. Right. It's so hard for us to do that.
It is, and I love that you have that kind of conversation and
Yes.
banter with your child, because
Yes.
it's really showing that it's okay to
It's
have
okay
emotions. It's okay to
yeah.
express them in front of people. You don't have
Yes.
to hide away to cry.
Yes.
You can just, and you don't have to tell someone else not to, or
Not
tease
to cry.
someone for it, because
Yeah.
emotions are human experience. We all have
Yes.
them, and we shouldn't feel
Yeah.
so ashamed that we have to do it behind closed doors. For so
Yeah.
long, I thought that if I wanted to cry, I used to hide under a basket, like, of my stuffed animals to cry, because I didn't want people to know I was crying, which was so silly because I was like 12 years old.
Yeah. Right.
And I was already telling myself I couldn't cry
Yeah.
when life
Yeah.
felt very overwhelming and hormones were happening and it's
Yeah.
life. And you should not be so afraid that you have to hide away to have an emotion and feel so
Right.
judged for it that you're literally hiding behind anything you can so that no one can even hear like a drop of that weep.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, it's really, I'm so glad for podcasts like this and getting this word out. Like, it's really okay to feel. Our world is so damaged in some ways because of this specific thing. Like, we don't have room for feelings, right? So many of us are like on social media constantly getting away from what we feel. Like, that's a great distractor, right? We think we're spending all this time seeking connection, but in fact, we're spending this time disconnected from ourselves, right? And disconnected from what we feel. It's so much easier to pop on TikTok or whatever, Instagram, whatever social media stuff you're on, so that I can focus on you instead of me, right? And so this message, like, hey, it's okay to feel. You shouldn't be ashamed of it. It's not a problem, is huge. There's a mental health crisis in teenagers right now. You cannot find an inpatient bed for somebody who's struggling with suicidality as a teen, because there's so much overwhelm and they're using social media to cope and they're not getting the resources they need. So it's super important. Like, it's okay to feel.
It is. And I think social media has so much potential.
Yes.
It really does. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, we're kind of into this idea that we should follow all the accounts that are exciting and all the people we want to be and idolize in a unrealistic way.
Right.
And I think for me, for so long, I would just sit on social media and scroll, looking at all these models and wondering why I wasn't 6 foot and 110 pounds and getting brand deals and walking the runway. And like internalizing that about myself and feeling more and more disconnected from who I am, who I want to be, and more consumed by this idea that I'm not good enough just based on genetics.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And like you said, it can be used for good and it can be used for harm. And we have to just be aware of that, because there is also a lot of great information out there for people to help people. You know what I mean? So that does exist too. And the problem is it's not really regulated, but if we keep bringing important, helpful content out there, it's going to tip the scales, because there is usefulness in it in a way that's, I think, really good. And it can be used exactly in the way that you're talking about. It's just like comparison, and then I'm less than kind of perspective, right?
Yeah, the accounts we follow and the content that's being put out can make all the difference. I learned so much from social media.
Yes.
I send reels to my friends all day. I don't know how they haven't blocked me yet, because I'll send like 100 at a time. But I'll be like, look, these are books we should be reading. These are different coping skills out there that we haven't thought of. These are positive quotes that can just make us smile. There's all these different good things on there that if we can just filter through the content and feel, first of all, we feel connected to ourselves, we may look for content that makes us feel really good and excited and happy instead of looking for content that kind of makes us feel better for something that we're struggling with internally.
Yeah. You know what what you're saying is really important, and I want, if people can think about being more mindful and deliberate about what you like, right? Because we know all these algorithms. Like if you're going to watch dark stuff, you're going to get more dark stuff in your feed. If you're going to watch or like positive stuff, you're going to get more positive stuff in your feed. So in that way, we kind of have control over what we get exposed to if we're more mindful of it. You know, this is such a weird thing. I don't know how the heck this happened on my feed. Like I started seeing these animals killing each other in Africa. Like I was like, I don't know how, like, and part of me in the beginning was like, what is this? And there was like an elephant attacking a giraffe or a hippopotamus attacking, like, it was like, first of all, who in the hell's creating this content? But I got in trouble because I was fascinated by it. And then all of a sudden, like all this animal violence shows up on my feeds all the time in TikTok. And I was like, Frank, you can stop this, you know? And I just stopped liking it. I stopped watching it because these algorithms are feeding us what they think we like, right? So you can't, and now I don't watch, they don't show up anymore. Like they're out of my algorithm. Like I don't have that anymore. And I'm like grateful, but it's like, it's a slippery slope, right? And one of the things I'll say, Fran, is like, we get PTSD and traumatized by exposure. Witnessing can cause PTSD, right? So if we're watching violent content all the time, we're affected by that, right? So we can have some say in not being traumatized by social media if we're more mindful and deliberate about the kind of content you watch the whole video versus 2 seconds of it. It affects the algorithm differently, right? So we can control the kind of exposure we have if we're more mindful and thoughtful about it.
Yeah, and I think we don't realize that we are opening ourselves up to experiencing trauma when we are watching these videos online.
That's right.
We think that that's only something that directly happens to us, but it can be something that happens even to a loved one so close to us. It can be something that happens to us. It could be something that we've seen and we experienced and we watched. It can be, so it does not have to be direct. So if you're watching videos that maybe make you feel unsafe, that make you feel some kind of pain, that aren't making you feel very good, you're opening yourself up to something that you have the control not to sometimes. Sometimes you have the control to close the app.
That's right.
And it's so important that we pay attention to how everything around us impacts us.
That's right. 100%. And I don't think people are aware of this enough. That's one of the things I'm doing also. I'm in a company called Trauma Informed Media. Like I started this company in LA with some producers for the point of bringing accurate trauma informed content to Hollywood. Like, so that people that get exposed to movies and documentaries and stuff like this are getting accurate depictions, and they're not getting traumatized by viewing it, right? So to thoughtfully get this content out in the world that's useful and valuable, not overexposing and traumatizing, right? And so it's been, there's a lot of trauma in Hollywood. And now there's this increased desire to get accurate trauma content out to the world. And I love being a part of the solution instead of the problem.
That is amazing. I'm so amazed by you. Every time you talk about something you're doing or have done, I'm just more and more fascinated. But it's so important that we're being responsible and accountable for what we're putting out there. And when we have some form of knowledge about what is happening, it's a choice. We can do what we can to hopefully make improvements, or we can choose to be ignorant and allow more people to get hurt. So the fact that you noticed something and
Right.
went out of your way to start working toward making it better
That's
and
right.
opened up other people's eyes to it is absolutely incredible. I'm so amazed by you.
Thank you. Thank you. Awareness is key in that way. You can't do anything. You can't do much about something that you don't have awareness over.
Yeah.
Right. So if we can bring awareness to more people, then like exactly like you're saying, you have more choice. It doesn't have to happen to you unconsciously. Like you can shift things with awareness. It's super important.
Yes, you can. As we are wrapping up, if someone's listening and they're like, you know what, I've experienced some trauma, I'm struggling, what is some advice for maybe something that they can do to get started to working toward their healing journey?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there are a lot of sites and websites and resources available for people. There's always, there's for people that have the ability to go into therapy to find a trauma therapist, trauma specialist is important if you have access to therapy. There's a lot of sites that can help give you information. Throw one other thing is if I'm not busy enough, I just started this month a trauma institute, right, to help provide trauma content for people. It's called traumainstitute.com. And that's a place that the website's going to be open in 2 weeks of resources for people. There are many people out there that are providing resources for people. Education is important, a community to get together of like-minded people to learn where appropriate trauma treatment is or how to just learn about it and do what you can on your own if you can't afford treatment or have access to it. So I'm trying as best I can collectively to bring this information out to the world. So don't be alone. Like, here's a quote from my second book called Transcending Trauma, is trauma blocks love and connection, and it's love and connection that heals trauma.
Thank you so much for listening to Normalize the Conversation. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. This podcast is an initiative of Inspiring My Generation, focusing on normalizing the conversation, bringing education and awareness to the forefront, and amplifying global voices to spark change and hope. Inspiring My Generation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization on a mission towards suicide prevention through awareness, conversation, education, and support. Connect with us on Instagram at Inspiring My Generation and visit our website inspiringmygeneration.org to learn more about our work and how you can make a difference.